My name is Seah, the chair for this round. On the panel, we have Amar, Hilmi, Wasid, and Sajid. Right? On the motion, this House would dilute the power of individual voters' ballot as it ages. Without further ado, may I now invite the Prime Minister to begin debate here.
Recently, I've had the dubious pleasure of spending a lot of time with people who are a lot older than me. And one of them, head of legal in China for a big fragrances company, said something interesting in a conversation over lunch. He said, well, the problem with democracies, the big ones in the first world, is that they're not dynamic anymore. They're really slow, ossified, as interest groups accumulate power over time. And there's no real reason or ability for the governments in these countries to fight against that, to push against that. There's no power big enough there. So he says, authoritarian regimes like China, far more democratic, far more dynamic rather. Government says, once they get this done, they get that done. And the real problem in this debate is, if you look around the world and the results of recent referendums and elections, it seems like democracies of the first world are in crisis. The voting systems, one person, one vote, consistently seem to generate outcomes that are, in the long run, seem terrible. That we've confronted this climate emergency in front of us for so long, and we've done very little, or in the case of many democratic governments, they've voted to actively push against that, or to pass policies that delay our ability to deal with that climate emergency. That they pass policies to be more nationalist, more racist, worse to the minorities and most vulnerable around them. And the thing about democracy and the shibboleths about one person, one vote is that at the end of the day, it's instrumental. If this system starts to fail and generates outcomes that no one wants, firstly, that is just bad, presumably for the people living there. But secondly, people will probably choose a new system, that of authoritarian government, which has its own attendant risks. I'm going to assume the opposition doesn't want the world to turn towards authoritarianism as a more dynamic alternative, because of the obvious costs. So thank you, associated with that. We think a big part of the reason why democracy is in crisis is because elderly voters are much less able to analyze what the correct outcomes are. They have much less skin in the game. They have less years ahead of them. They simply don't care. Their mindsets are locked in the past. But most importantly, we think there's a severe amount of political apathy from the youth. Young people want to participate in politics, but they realize it is an arena where they are firstly and crucially outnumbered. They are outnumbered because of the aging population and the demographic trends in the whole of the West, and therefore much of the democratic world are against them. They are less right now, and they will even be less as a portion of the electorate in the future for a really, really long time, until of course that reverses as people start to pass away. But the point is that they know that the odds are stacked against them. Because of that, and because old people have that time to accrue finance and power in the various halls of industry and politics, they turn away from politics and then no longer invested. Yes.
Why are young people's ideas and like a priori better than like old people's idea? And why is it a faster process better if not better discourse and longer negotiations not a good thing too?
Okay, so the answer to the second bit of that question is the system is broken now and it will likely lead to many, many bad outcomes in the interim. We don't think we can wait for that. We think voting reform needs to happen now, and that discourse is not happening because young people are now, as I just said, locked out of participation. Answer to the first bit of the POI about why young people are better is part of my speech, fairly obviously. Okay, quick model, which is we would make your vote share decline after the age of 50. We think before the age of 50, you're fully paid up participant of the workforce. You have many years ahead of you, especially with the advent of medical technology. We think this is a reasonable cutoff. After this, the way we'll do that is your vote will become, when you vote as per normal, and then your vote will go in, will be recorded based on the census, and it will discount the vote share of the people above 50. We're happy to do so either just kind of like everyone above 50 gets half a vote, or kind of have gradations between 60, 70, and so on and so forth. We don't think really matters. The point here is that it's clear that the vote of someone who is before 50 years old is worth more, significantly more, than the vote of someone who is 50 or less. Why is this the easiest version of voting reform to sell? It's easier than any other form of voting reform that aims to put power in the hands of the most vulnerable, because it targets a class of people that is massively sympathetic. Youth and like young people, youth, people with a bright future. Think about every single political move, like mass protest political movement in the West. Not to say that there's mass support for climate change, like advocacy, not to say there's mass support for gun rights advocacy, but these issues have gotten far more sympathetic when children and young people have gotten on board. And that implies that children and the young are a stakeholder that everyone can defend far more than if you were to allocate votes along things like social class, or giving more votes to the poor, or giving more votes to the racially disadvantaged, and so on and so forth. So in terms of alternative modes of voting reform, this is the easiest to pass and the least likely to create massive backlash. Why do we think the elderly are worse voters and the young are better voters in comparison to the elderly? Well, a number of reasons here. The first reason we think is, in terms of long-term and short-term policy making, the young have a longer time horizon on which to be on this planet and to live with the consequences of decisions, so they're far more likely to consider long-term consequences and long-term policies. We think that is one area in which the young are more invested and therefore better able to do this analysis. Note that voting age laws already presume some level of maturity, so we don't think that the young will vote in an immature fashion, especially since this age bracket extends all the way up to 50. Note that on issues like climate change, that not only do the elderly vote the way they do because of the fact that they have less skin in the game by virtue of the fact that there's less life to live, but note also that most of the milestones they've achieved in life have already been met, which means that they may well choose to see politics as a game with less investment in the real consequences of the vote decisions they're voting for and the policies they're supporting, because the policies either don't materially affect them anymore, or because they think that most of their life achievements have been met, and so then can just think of politics as sport. Additionally, the old often have entrenched views. Most of the time you develop your views along the time when you're, I guess in between the ages of 18 and say around age 30, that's when ideas are most impressioned upon you and you kind of build your worldview based on that. That of course can change with time, but I think it likely ossifies with time, which means that the old often are locked in entrenched views and are often unable to account for new information or new paradigms like technological change, which change the way you ought to think about and weigh decisions in the status quo. Additionally, the old are often prone to nostalgia. Because of the notion, because you're used to the way the world was as you grew up as a young person, you lock that worldview in and compare current events against that worldview. For example, that explains why often you see elderly people being unable or find it more difficult to let go of latent and subconscious racism or sexism because they were taught that this was moral, and the stuff you believe is moral as a young person is the stuff that you continue to believe is moral into the future with progress. So the point is, elderly voters are chronically less capable of analyzing this new information and making good decisions based on it. They're far less invested. That is the reason to fight this democracy crisis. We think it's important to turn more votes over the young.
I thank the Prime Minister for the speech, and I let the Leader of Opposition to continue the debate.
Very good. Panel, we use a system of democracy because we don't objectively know what is a good policy. We don't objectively know which views are objectively correct and which views are wrong. It therefore means that a lot of what Jan says about there's a right way that we need to think about things. Long term is better than short term. There are some things like the elderly's views that is objectively wrong. That is untrue. Because a democracy was always supposed to aggregate what our society feels is right. Like in the United States, we thought that having guns was a pretty damn good thing. But in Singapore, we think that is a bad idea. The reason is because, and whatever the significance of what I'm saying is, that is not what we want objectively to be good, but what society wants. And the only way to do that is through a one-man, one-vote system. What do we stand for in opposition? Very clearly, quickly about policy. We are going to stand for votes with equal weight. Elderly with mental conditions, for example, will not be allowed to vote. I think that's fairly standard democracy. So quickly I want to deal with the things Jan says. Jan says, one man, one vote will lead to authoritarianism. I mean, that's just bizarre, because there are just many reasons why people will not go to authoritarian regimes. people love their rights and things like that. I just feel like his whole speech about how it will suddenly convert into an authoritarian regime was just largely unrealistic. The next thing they said was, oh, but we can vote for what's right for them. So things like environmental policy, for example, oftentimes requires things like policy trade-offs. Things like how maybe you have to have less economy as compared to protect the environment, for example. And I'm unclear as to whether these policies are objectively good. And as a result, we argue that what's important is to ensure that every single member of society has a say on that. They then say, oh, but it causes apathy, right? Young people don't turn up to the vote. First, if their problem is apathy, I mean, there are just many other ways in which we can increase that, like we can ensure that they are less apathetic. But if their argument is that they're being crowded out right now, it seems to me like they are going to be less apathetic and turn up to the vote, because they are going to be crowded out even more if they do not turn up to the ballot box. So it seems to me like the problem is reversed on their side of the house. They then say, oh, they then say, oh, the reason why we should not allow these elderly people to vote is because they will treat it like a game, right? It's almost like a game of soccer. They just want all the intense drama. Not true. The people and old people in society have their people who are living as young people right now. Their children, their family, their friends. And these are all good reasons why they are unlikely to screw up the system of democracy just because they see it as a game. I mean, there are just many other better reasons why they are likely to vote in correct ways, or for the fact that they might be personally affected for the number of years they are going to live in this earth, because their death at the end of the day is still an uncertain thing at an uncertain age, and as a result they still have to live through the policy decisions they make. It's unclear why they are likely to just vote in ways that are going to mess up with our democracy. So I think the claim that Jan makes just does not make sense there. The last claim that Jan makes is that, oh, there are things like they are able to live up for these policy outcomes for a shorter period of time, and as a result they should have less say. No, the way in which we are intensely affected by policies is not by the number of years, but the severity and intensity of it. Therefore, if you are even affected by 1 day or 1 month, that is still an equally important political position and political stand you must make, and as a result, that claim that Jan makes just does not make sense. I'm going to quickly transition on to my argument right now about how they hurt the old and why we improve politics as a whole. First, about how they hurt the old. So, we start from the intuitive premise that most people that are old are people who have already left the working force. There are little or no guarantees for them for two broad reasons. The first is that there's very little incentive for them to be involved politically, because there's little to no economic contribution they can make right now without votes as a leverage against politicians to care about them. But second, as they already said, the quantity of these old people are very small at best. Therefore, we think that the only way we are able to ensure that politicians constantly care about them is through the check and balance of a ballot box. They don't say, oh, but they have lived up most of their milestones in life. No, they have not lived out the most important milestones, of which they need to care and depend on the government the most for. Things like healthcare, things like end-of-life care. And that is why we need to have that leverage against the government to ensure that the government is able to deliver things on them. What is the counterfactual on their side of the house? Two things. One, the political campaigning that politicians have on their side of the house is unlikely to have any incentive to cater for the old. The reason is because if they constitute such a small percentage of the votes, politicians just generally have absolutely no incentive to care about them. But second, I think those are the kind of issues old people care about. Things like healthcare, things like end-of-life care. I think what happens is that these issues also get a lot less political traction for. I'm not just going to preemptively say that even if they have some sort of mechanism to ensure that they protect the interests of the old. I'm not sure what it is, but what I can confirm is that these mechanisms that they might have on their side is only largely based on goodwill. Goodwill of the political population that are voting right now. The counterfactor we have on our side is a guarantee. A guarantee that through their vote they have some leverage to ensure that politicians and the government of the day have some sort of incentive to care about them. That is why it's important. Sure.
Look, initially you say you don't really care which way a society votes as long as it votes. But now you seem to be suggesting that a certain segment of society has interests that you deem correct.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that everyone has interests. The old have some interests as well, like end-of-life care, like healthcare, that would not be guaranteed Otherwise, without the vote, because this comes at policy trade-offs like higher taxes for the young. Simple and intuitive line on our side of the house. Alright, second argument about how I think on our side we have less polarizing policies and less radical policies on their side. So I think the thing about politics right now is not about polar opposites, about Brexit or no Brexit. But the thing about it is now that young people are going to be fervently believing in one degree of the spectrum and old the other. And I think the only way we can reconcile and improve politics as a whole is not to say that one side is right or one side is wrong. Because oftentimes, it's about what democracy should be about. It's about reconciling policies to a middle ground. The only way we are able to do that and to ensure that our policies are going to be neutral and tailored to the needs of every single individual on the ground is to ensure that every single individual gets one vote on the ground. That is to say that we are able to ensure that the kind of policies we're going to make is not going to be radically right or radically left, given the characterizations on both sides of the house. So, crucially, the point I want to make here is that there's no right way to vote, and the only way we can ensure that we protect our democracy is to aggregate every single person's interest so that we are able to see what society wants. For those reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for this speech, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the statement.
Panel, it is naive to suggest that we are chimpanzees and we have no moral lens to view our political process and a democratic institution, that we cannot shape outcomes which are deemed to be objectively better. We do have an idea of what leads to a sustainable life. We do have an idea of what betters the population that lives under our constitution, and we think we can tweak democracy to be dynamic enough to cater to that population. We think the beautiful thing about democracy is that it protects the balance between the present and the future. We think currently democratic outcomes in political process are often very short-termist due to the many reasons that Jan gave you, be it numerical minority of the young people or many other reasons such as nostalgia and short-termist view of the older ones. We think we want to restore the balance between those outcomes and can see that we have an urgency for voting reform to make democracy serve both factions equally. I'm going to talk about a few things in my speech. I'm going to talk about why tweaking democracy and its principles is okay. Secondly, I'm going to talk about solving political apathy in the youth. And lastly, I'm going to talk about, again, young voters versus old voters and what they vote on. But let's first deal with this big chunk that came out from LO, right? They told us, but we don't have objectively good things in the world. Even if we agree to that basis, right, that we don't want any objective good thing in the world, I think one basic rational basis on which to make decisions is how outcomes impact individuals and people in society. So we're not focusing on what's correct or not, we're just focusing on the amount of impact it can have on an individual's life. So at the point of time where the impact of a certain individual, of a certain political process or a policy is much more, I think they do deserve a more say or a bigger chunk of the voting power in order to drive that outcome home. We're focusing on impacts, right? Because at the point of time where we see that it impacts people, and impacts is what determines democracy in the first place, we think we can make that view in the first place. Sit down. We tell you that democracy can be tweaked, right? The dynamism of democracy means that the objective we want, we can tweak it to achieve it, Mr. Speaker. We gave you many reasons why there's an urgency for voting reform. But on the flip side, recognize that in very many times we do often know what objectively the good thing to do is. When science proves that climate change is a threat to human existence in and of itself, we think we objectively know that we need to shape democracy to reach a conclusion where climate change is something that we tackle on an urgent basis. We know that in countries like, say, India or like America or like Germany, where AfD and right-wing nationalism is leading to extreme outcomes against minority populations, we often tweak democracy to provide safeguards for those institutions. We think at the point of time where you have vulnerable people in the population, when you basically put their future and sustained livelihood at stake, we think we can tweak democracy to reach that outcome. That is what we're doing on our side by making sure that the power goes to the right people in the first place that have more skin in the game to lead a sustainable livelihood for a larger period of time. We think with personality politics, the second thing they tell us then is, but the autocratic or authoritarian regime would not happen suddenly. That's precisely the point. The fact that we are so passive about this issue is that we're leading towards a world where this authoritarian regime is something that leads, there's something that an outcome that we can foresee. We think that's bad because, firstly, we think that's true because, as I said, you can see with Modi coming in, an alternative for Deutschland in Germany, for Trump politics, etc., where personality politics have basically become alluring more and more to the voting population. We think we're turning towards a regime wherein policies matter less than the idea of that individual leading our country. Given that that's true, we think we need to change that balance back to wherein policies matter more, where the sustained livelihood of individuals is the priority of those voting populations. Sit down. Second thing, we told you that now that I've proven the need for a voting reform, we told you why this voting reform is the best way to do it, right? Because we think that there are many objectively worse, like minority populations in society, right? We think African American individuals, we think women, and so on and so forth are often subjected to very many barriers and hurdles to succeed. But the point is, in order to pass a voting reform, you need buy-in, right? At the point of time where old people have their children at home, where old people know that this is a generation coming after them, as Ryan told you, that sympathy often comes from like school shootings, when kids are at stake, and so on and so forth, means that very many of these people often have a personal stake in knowing that the next generation coming after them will be taken care of. We think it's the easiest voting reform to inculcate, and it's the most prevalent, in which you know that it transcends the racial barrier, it transcends the gender barrier, it transcends the economic barrier in order for people to buy into it. We think this voting reform will then lead to a more sustained form of like political process that goes ahead. So we think everybody is faced with the fact that the population and generation is coming after them, and we need to take care of them. Before I move on to political apathy, Andre.
If you already know the correct policies and decisions to make in society, why for us the opinions of people?
We
Just
don't
make
know
the policies, right?
This is exactly my point. We don't know what the correct policy is, but we know who the people to make the correct decisions are. So we let them vote on those policies and let them decide what outcome they want. So we are not dictating policies, we are dictating that these people are the right stakeholders to reach those policies in the first place. That's the key distinction that you're ignoring under your speech. So political apathy and why youth are locked out, right? Jan gave you many reasons. I'm going to tell you why that is solved during this particular process because I think he ran out of time. First, this move by the state would signal to the youth in the first place that their votes do matter and that they can reach outcomes given in the first place they feel apathetic right now because they're numerically disadvantaged. Now that their votes do matter, they're more likely to partake in the political process. But on the flip side, political parties are more likely to appoint candidates and political platforms and policies that appeal to the young voters, given that they now form a bigger chunk of the individuals voting for these political parties. We think we engage more youth and more young people in participating in the political process in the first place. Now lastly, let's talk about something that they missed from Jan's speech. Why old voters often vote in weird ways. First, nostalgia, right? Given that you led your life and a successful life in those past eras, you often want to recreate that world that you lived through. This could look like the economic expansion of America in 80s and 90s. This could look like the Eurozone being created in the 90s, and so on and so forth. So you often want to vote for policies that possibly recreate that sense of success for you, which might not be the most sustainable one, as we can see right now in America going forward. Second, you're less vulnerable because you're economically secure. They talk about pension schemes and healthcare plans, right? Those things already do exist and possibly are outnumbered in favor of the old people. But more importantly, even if young people are making that decision, they know they're going to get old one day. So they're more likely to vote for that sustained same healthcare and pension plans under their scenario as well. Yeah. Third and last thing is that you have no skin in the game with regards to long-termist futures. You have very short-termist ideas with regards to your month and your day getting better. We think we need to tilt the balance back to where democracy wants it to be.
Yes.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech. We're now inviting the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the debate.
Yeah.
Democracy is not under siege. Democracy may be slow, it may be painful to come to a common consensus, but democracy is good that way. It's because we are able to make the effort to consider the opinion of someone else. Someone from a background that we cannot imagine, we cannot empathize because we never went through the same situations and struggles that they did. That allows us to come to a better decision of a common good that's not just good for me, but good for us. Every participating member of this society that signed up to vote on policies that will affect us all. We don't think that there is a need to reform the democratic system. Maybe the only reform we need is to have greater voter turnout. And what worse to actually discourage people to turn up to vote is to tell them your votes don't count. That's why the indigenous people, the people in the minority groups don't come up and vote because their votes don't matter anyway, their numbers don't matter anyway. And that's why they will not join the political discourse. You tell a group of people beyond the age of 50 that they get half their votes or possibly lesser as they age, that's where they are not going to care anymore. I don't know why they still bother giving these people some votes if these votes don't matter at all. Because to some extent, they think these lives matter too. The question is, will these policies still consider them as human beings where their lives and livelihood matter in our decisions of policy making? The answer is no. No, thank you. You had your chance. When Yang came out and told us, we know who makes better decisions because they make terrible ones. They are short-term in their mindset, they don't live as long, and we are outnumbered by them. You know who says those words? The rich about the poor. That they can't make proper decisions because they aren't educated. They can't see the bigger picture. They don't know economics. They outnumber us, right? They live shorter lives than us because they don't have proper access to healthcare, and we probably know what's good. But is that true? No. Why is it so? Because our ability to make good decisions in democracy is not contingent on your intellect. It's not contingent on your ability to be all-encompassing. No, it's contingent on your ability to be selfish, to understand your individualistic needs. And that's where we think that the concept of good differs from each person to each person. A democracy is not deciding what a good decision for a human being is and designing a political decision to achieve that good. A democracy is good. It's about us being able to prioritize what's important for each and every one of us and then obtain the consensus good, right? So they are flawed in the conception of what a good decision is because there isn't one good, correct one. Because our values mature over time. Our values change over time. We regress sometimes. And we think that the all do not have an objectively bad ability or wrongful ability to make those decisions. But I say no, there are some immutable traits about the old. One of them is that they can't consider about the young. In the same way they claim that the young will consider about the old because they grow old, the old consider about the young because they were once young, right? And they understand what it's like because their children are going to go through that. Their grandchildren are going to go through the same struggle. They are there to restrain the powers of a failing democratic system because they understand what were the triggers of a failure to the past. They went through wars, they went through economic downturns. They understand what the points in which our decisions were impulsive and therefore led us to a downfall. So when they make decisions in consideration of the young, they made it because they were once young. Do situations change? Could they be wrong? Yes. Could we use our other votes to be able to educate them, to counteract them? Yes. But is it necessarily always true that the policies they support are wrongful? No. But they say, look, but their lives are going to end very soon, right? So they won't give a shit anymore. They're going to chill and have fun. I don't know, most people don't imagine them dying pretty soon. They think they always live forever, right? No, thank you. But importantly is that they want to be able to make policies because that's a projected version of their legacy, of that generation's legacy. That's what we stood for, the values that we had, and the values that we will pass on. So it's unbelievable that when you think that your end is near, all you want to do is watch the world burn. But more importantly, they make decisions because of what it means to them today. Right? That they have to bear the consequences of those policies either. We told you that the experience of policies isn't about the number of days you live through it. Sometimes it's about how you feel beyond being able to quantify it by the number of days. Why? Because if you're right, the old shouldn't give a shit about gay marriage. Because they're already past the age of marriage, right? They're already done with those shit. Technically, you should let the young people do whatever they want. It's because the values that were compromised, the principles that hurt them, the wrath of God that they may experience, are things that are far beyond the remaining 20 years or 15 years that they live. And that the vote is an extension of the expression of how important it is to them. If general society disagrees with them, general society can have an overwhelming vote to tell them that they are wrong. But if general society has a large vote that also concurs with that belief, no thank you, then that should be the normatively good decision that society ought to make. But then they say, oh, what about nostalgia? They always remain in the past. But nostalgia are the lessons learned from them. Lessons that the young do not have, right? And if anything, we are possibly only able to amalgamate those experiences in the most truest of sense because their self-interest and their very own stake are integrated in the very vote that they cast. So they cannot have a half vote, right? Because they are equally as able to make a decision as the young would. Yes.
Andre, in the vast majority of representative parliamentary democracies, you vote for a constituent, and that constituent has the same vote in parliament regardless of whether your constituency has 100 people or 2,000 people. Is that unfair?
Actually, there's too much gibberish. I mean, you change the parliament system like that, you just give equal votes, right? Like seriously, the democratic system is not what the discussion is. Whether it's a parliamentary democracy or whatever fucking democracy, I don't care. The question right now is, even in those situations, if you are older, do you get half a vote? If you are a political candidate that's older, should you get half a vote? The answer is no. Because you don't get to decide who is the correct person to make decisions on behalf of us. Because the only system that allows that is a dictatorship. Where we cede power to one person who knows better for us. And that's not what we're supporting. Both sides want democracy. Right? But more importantly, it's also because that our inability to empathize with another person means that we are unable to experience the pain, the values, the goals, the dreams of another human being. Right? And that means to say any political decision that has got trade-offs always has to consider what the effect on a human being is. That if you want to support the environment, there's an overwhelming reason why it's good, right? But it's also about the loss of jobs, the inability to feed your families and educate your children. And maybe those things are far more important than being able to live under 42 degrees like hot sun. Maybe that's important. But because you don't know for sure how I'm living, you don't get to make the call. And that's why everyone gets a free vote.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for the speech. We now invite the government whip to conclude the debate for their bench here.
Ask him. Ask him. It's okay, bro. Okay.
Ask what Andre said in the last 15
Yeah.
What? None of us could hear what you said in the last 15 seconds. Could you say again?
You know what? It's recording, bro. Can play back. It's like good, right? Reliable. Reliable.
Mr. Speaker, between two sides here, there's a fundamental disagreement on what democracy is supposed to be, right? And that side thinks that democracy is not a system where you decide that this is the best consequence and you design a system to lead to that. But we exactly feel that. We think that democracy is a system that where you feel that this set of policies in a democratic system would lead people to making the most optimal decision, and you design a system that is based on ensuring that that system leads to that, right? I'm going to give you reasons why that is the fairer way to shape democracy. And the crux of that disagreement is a moral disagreement. Those guys feel that we are looking at this debate from a completely neutral perspective. Like, we absolutely don't have any moral stake in this debate, and therefore, obviously, the only decision that we can make is just give everyone equal votes, and people are going to decide what is the truth, right? But to answer his very question, if I have the ability today to just wish a world in which there is no democracy, but people live happy lives, and there is no misery, and there is no sadness, and there are no women being exploited, there are no minorities being exploited, and all of that actually did happen, then I think all of us would choose that world. Because we do have a moral compass in this debate. We look at this debate from that perspective, and we implement a lot of policies. Every single decision that we make on things is from that perspective. Otherwise, the case is very absurd, that we don't know anything about anything, but we just know that democracy is correct, right? That is an inconsistent and contradictory position to hold in this debate. And we acknowledge it already, Mr. Speaker, in a number of ways in a democracy, right? So the example that Jan pointed out in the POI, that in many democracies, there's a system of proportional representation. And in many places, like heavily populated regions have their votes underweighted, because otherwise, if you were to give every person a single vote, that region's like needs would surpass and like overtake the needs of other regions, and other people would suffer at that time. So there's already a process of equalizing that, right? Sit down. We don't give young people vote, like people who are below the age of 18. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? That is because we don't think that those people are going to make good decisions, right? How do we know that they're not going to make good decisions? We believe that they're probably going to make short-term decisions. They're not going to think about the long-term consequences. They don't have enough experience, right? All of those are decisions that we exercise on a daily basis and we accept as legitimate parts of our democracy. Those guys needed to address that. Another example, criminals are not given votes. We believe that these people are bad people. They don't have a good moral compass. We don't think that they are going to make good decisions for society, and we don't give them votes, Mr. Speaker. So I just don't think that this is okay. Okay, so, no, sit down. And the reason, Mr. Speaker, is that we just know that certain things are objectively correct. We don't know the exact policy that might be correct, and for that, no individual person should have the ability to say that this is the exact policy that should be like implemented, but we kind of know where we are heading in a moral sense, right? So for example, a world in which African Americans are being exploited, or a world in which women don't have equal rights, right? Or a world in which we like condemn our world to a climate crisis where millions of people are going to drown in the sea and are going to like starve and are going to die miserable deaths. That is clearly not what we are going to stand for. If we can avoid that, that is a good thing on our side, right? So this whole idea that there is some, just taking the example of the climate change thing, that there's some present versus future balancing act, delicate balancing act that needs to be done is complete nonsense. That is an excuse for the fact that we cannot relate to the future people. That is to give us assurance that we don't need to care about them. But actually, if we know that millions of people in the future are going to suffer in worse ways than the few people who are going to lose jobs right now, that is the more important consideration, and that we need to stand for that. What did we tell you? Why did we think that the elderly needed less votes, or should be given less votes to achieve these decisions, right? The first thing that we told you was that often they don't vote for long-term policies because they're just not affected by that, right? The young people are more affected by climate change. They will have to suffer those consequences, and therefore they are more likely and more trustworthy to vote in that regard. The second thing that we said, that the elderly have already lived a significant portion of their life, and therefore the education policy of the country, right, or the economic policy of the country does not affect them at an individual level as much as it does the young people who still have to struggle for jobs, who still have to think about what schools and colleges to send their children, right? And therefore, they start looking at politics as a game. And Andre's response to this was, oh yeah, but like they still have like family and friends and they're being young ones, etc., right? But Mr. Speaker, that's not what gets people to vote. Realizing that there's a group out there, or knowing that there are like some people who are going to be affected by some policy and that's a bad thing, doesn't get people to consider that important enough to get out of their house or to vote, or take that as more important than the things that they want personally, right? What gets people to vote is when they are personally affected, when they feel that they are under siege, when they feel that they must act to stop an impending crisis, right? And that is why the young people who feel that these are things that personally affect them are things that are going to change those problems. Before I move on, yes.
If the elderly make bad decisions, why do you even bother giving them half a vote? Because you're only supposed to stand for dilution.
No, I think, no. Like, yeah, I think that there are some important elements in the votes that elderly people make. I think the young people's votes are more important, therefore it's a continuous function, right? Like, I mean, I think that's why just things in discrete terms, we can like discuss that and explain these things to them later. Okay, third thing we told you is that their views are entrenched, and they don't change their ideas about things as much. Why is it a good thing to change ideas about society? It's because we learn in a society when we grow. We recognize that women deserve equal rights, and like we didn't need to be homophobes, and we needed to accept sexual minorities. All of these are things that we run along the run of civilization, and we needed to accept those things. Okay. The problem that they had was that old people are now moving on to the next point. The problem they had was old people are completely going to be neglected, right? I don't think that's the case. Because the problems of old people are quite similar. Healthcare, pension, and so on and so forth, right? I think that means that they can serve as a common voting bloc, and that means that will serve as opposed to the disparate needs of young people, and that kind of balances the voting ability that the old people have. So we don't need to be very concerned about that. But the more important consideration in this debate, Mr. Speaker, was even under their own criteria, and this is something that they didn't respond to, is that the youth today are apathetic to the political system, and they are not coming out to vote because they feel that they are outnumbered, they feel that their voices do not count. And we need this as a signaling process to say that you are important. And now we believe that you are important to make them actually come out of their houses to vote. So even under their criteria, if more people are supposed to vote, under our policy, more young people are going to come out and become consistent voters across their lifetime. More parties are going to shape their policies in a way that it is youth-oriented and actually serves and caters to their needs so that they are more engaged in the political system. For all of those reasons, incredibly proud to be the host.
I thank the government whip for the speech, and I invite the opposition whip to conclude the case for opposition.
Yeah. Oh, Bryan Chan here to support his.
Oh! Dude, it's not personal, bro.
I want to do three things in my speech. The first is to examine how should we determine who gets to vote. Second, why is it that we uniquely help the elderly? And lastly, why is it that a lot of these claims they want to make is a problem-solution mismatch, crisis of democracy, and voting reform, and those are things that I don't think are specific to the sort of mechanisms you're proposing within the context of this debate. First issue I want to talk about, how should we determine who gets to vote? I think we started from a pretty clear base principle that the life of an old individual is equally meaningful, equally important, and equally valuable to the life of a young individual. The second base principle we started out also was that the outcomes of policies and whether or not a politician is good or bad has no definitive correct answer. Even using the examples of climate change, right? There is no definitive answer to say that we have to abandon all sorts of economic policies in favor of climate change, because it is morally grey as to whether climate change is more important or the economy is more important. What this means is that oftentimes, as an elderly individual, your interests are often equally important vis-a-vis that of a young individual. But more crucially, only you yourself can defend your own interests, and that is why we need to empower you with the right to vote. More importantly, right, they can propose to us a criteria of experience in terms of giving people more rights to vote. We can also propose a criteria of contribution as giving people more right to vote. Crucially, right? So we can say, for instance, that, a poor person shouldn't have that much rights to vote because a poor person doesn't epistemically understand the sort of economy, the sort of formal economy. The problem is that these sorts of criteria are often set by people in positions of power. So when Jan wants to talk about devolving authoritarian regimes, I suggest that sort of rhetoric that he talks about, crisis of democracy, some people being less able to vote than others, is often used to justify removing sort of political power from different groups. And that is why if they want to talk about authoritarian regimes, I suggest that they set the preconditions for a far slippier slope to that regime. Then they told us that there is an absolute moral code, right? Clearly, what Andre tells you is that there's no clear absolute moral code. If there was a clear absolute moral code, why is there even a need for democracy, right? You can just use absolute authoritarian regimes to impose that absolute moral code. I think we need to recognize the middle ground in this debate is that there are certain issues that are perhaps morally beneficial, but these are issues that fundamentally have to be decided by the individuals and the individuals themselves. Sharique tells us criminals and children. So children might not be able to understand the ramifications of the policies. I suggest it's incredibly ageist to say an elderly individual who's lived through experiences of war and economic crisis doesn't epistemically understand what certain policies mean to him. For a criminal, the criminal isn't continuously living within that society, within the social interactions. I think it's just using very flippant and random parallels to try and prove their point. So, what is the upshot of this first clash? I think the upshot of this first clash is that I don't think they can definitively say that the life of the young individual is more important than the life of an old individual. This moves me nicely to the second question then. Given that the life of an elderly individual is equally meaningful, why is it that only on our side of the house we can guarantee that we help the life of the elderly? And Jan's criteria from the start of the debate was that, but the elderly doesn't feel the impacts of policies, and because they don't feel the impacts of the policies, we don't have to give them the right to vote. If I can show you that they actually do feel concrete, tangible impacts, I think we win this debate. So, what they say down the bench is that these policies, in their words, don't materially affect the old. But it does, right? If you're an old individual, if you're an elderly individual, you often have no more income because you're out of a job. Oftentimes, as societies progress, societies like Singapore, the standard of living and the cost of living has increased to such an extent that your savings are not enough for you to continue living viably within the context of a society. This means you often need the government's help, you need the politicians' help to have welfare policies, to have end-of-life policies. And that is why we need to give you that right to vote for a politician, to have a leverage over a politician, to vote for a politician who will necessarily pass good policies for you. What did we hear from their side of the house? They said, but you know what? Young and old have similar concerns. No, right? The young is unlikely to vote in the old person's favor. Why? Because supporting a politician or supporting a cause like end-of-life care often entails greater taxes for the young. There is no reason whatsoever that a young might want to do that, because that increases the sort of onerous burdens on a young. But second, at a point in which you don't have a meaningful political say, politicians have no reason whatsoever to campaign in your interest. What does that mean? That means that on their side of the house, there is absolutely no political will at all, no thank you, to help these old individuals. That is to say, what my first speaker told you is that on their side of the house, helping the elderly, no thank you, relies on the absolute goodwill of politicians and young people, and that is something that we cannot stand for. Because if you believe that an old individual is equally meaningful and as equally valuable in life as a young individual, then you have to believe that we need to give this old individual the same ability to protect himself as we give a young individual. That is why in terms of who helps the elderly, I think we have the unique solvency for that. Let's get a third thing, right? Voting reform. No, thank you. What did it tell us? They said, but we hurt the young because the young are numerically disadvantaged. I mean, realistically, if you think about it, if their policy is up to the age of 50, right? I suggest if individuals from 0 to 50, or rather 18 to 50, all turned up at the ballot box, they would definitely outnumber individuals from 50 to 80, right? So, what is the reason people don't turn up, right? The reason people don't turn up might be because of things like political apathy, right? But that is reform political apathy, right? But more importantly, if you look at a recent Indonesian example, right? It was because young people felt threatened, and that's why they came out in droves to vote for Jokowi. So that is one way we can solve political apathy. That is one way we can get the youth to be more involved in it. But on the counterfactual, young people are going to be far more apathetic on their side of the house. Why? Because if young people know that they are so superior in numbers now, that all the old people have diminished votes, half a vote, quarter vote, whatever the policy is, then because we are so superior in numbers, why is there even need for me to turn up at the ballot box? That means that if political apathy is an issue on their side of the house, it's far exacerbated. What did we hear from Virat? Virat says, but there are personality politics. Once again, I think that's a generic harm. Why is it because of this specific mechanism in the debate that we have personality politics? Because populist politicians can also appeal to young people, right? Look at Greece in 2014, where we were extremely populist politicians campaigning against austerity, was extremely popular among young people as well. I'm not sure why personality politics is a harm that is exclusive to old people, and it's not something that young people can be particularly susceptible to as well. The last thing they say is that, but there's certain objectively good things, right? We want to solve racism and sexism in society, ignoring what Andre tells you, that these are often issues that are up to societies themselves to decide, right? You as a liberal individual cannot tell individuals what is absolutely moral to believe in. But more importantly, and this ignores what Pearson tells you, discussion is important, discourse is important, because we want the buy-in of these elderly individuals. The buy-in of these elderly individuals is important, because day-to-day interactions still take place. That is to say, if you don't solve sexism, if you don't convince them of the reason not to support racism, the sort of like toxicity and like day-to-day interactions that accrue in more violence psychologically and physically to the marginalized minorities within society still occur. For all these reasons, very proud to stand on the side of opposition.
I thank the opposition whip for the speech. May I now invite the opposition reply to conclude the debate with the bench here.
You know, the common rhetoric of dictators like Marcos, Park Chung-hee, is that our democracy is under siege. We have people who are holding us hostage, people who should not have a voice, people whom we can take care and we won't know what's best for them. And that's how they impose martial law, restrict rights, take away, silence people and all that. It's the same inside government. They think that somehow this mysterious government that overlords this motion gets to decide what's objectively correct. And we told you there's no such objective correctness. He said, but all of us have this innate moral code. If it's that innate, then technically you get a majority vote on your side. The reason why you don't get a majority vote in favor of things like abortion, in favor of things like the environment, is because that's not a universal moral code that people share. And if it is, and it's that easy to convince, then I'm pretty sure the alternative is to teach them what is correct. And the thing is, we don't get to pick and choose and set those conditions for when you get your votes reduced and not. Because they on their side say, no, the right standard should be that the number of years you have left should determine the strength of your vote. Then in that case, we can also impose new conditions, right? The amount of commitment you make to the country should to determine the extent of your vote. The amount of nationalistic feel you have in your body should also improve the strength of your vote. No, we don't get to make any normative decisions on when your vote should be stronger, because there's only one criteria to the strength of your vote: your membership in this society, your willingness to receive decisions on policies made by the state and to contribute in the way that the state determines you to be. So at the end of the day, if they want a democracy, they cannot cede to an authoritarian system in which they decide what's best for the people, because there is no good decision, and the only good decision is one that the people organically come to. But I said, but the elderly themselves are handicapped. They can't make good decisions, right? Because they are old, sometimes they make silly decisions, and they are resistant to change. I don't think so. They are old, they have a lot of experience, things that we've never gone through. They're able to educate us on the life lessons that they had. In fact, they're very much invested in the lives of the people to come. And to leave a legacy when they pass on, that the society they leave behind is moral, is correct, and likely to be prosperous as well. Because the shame, the pain that they went through are reasons why they want to avoid those things. So when they make decisions, right, to prioritize the economy, right, those are decisions that are made in good faith, in a rightful belief that they are the right decisions to be made. But then again, they said, no, but then you don't really make that good decisions. But we also argue that because decisions in a democracy are made selfishly, a good decision is one that you should make to prioritize your own interests, even if you make them to be in priority of welfare or pension schemes and things like that, and that's fine. Because there are counteracting forces to balance that out. If people are not willing to contribute as much, then maybe it won't get passed. And that's fine. But the important thing here that they never want to deal with is that this policy systematically takes away the rights of the old. They will never be able to pass policies in favor of them towards the end of their lives. Because every of that policy requires a contribution from the young, to increase taxes from their employment salary, to be able to force them to commit to responsibilities. And if everybody is self-interested in making their vote, they wouldn't agree to that. So it doesn't matter if it's 50%, 45%, 55%. The reduction in that vote means that you take away the ability of the old to demand for the same degree of rights that they want. And so systematically, you will oppress the old. A democracy is one that allows for every one of us to empathize and to make a good decision for the common folk. They undermine that very system, and we're very proud.
I thank the opposition reply to conclude this debate, and I invite the government reply.
Go yeah. I'm glad you're buying into our culture of stability.
As two wise Indians once said, democracy is not two lions and one sheep deciding what to have for dinner. Democracy, as both teams seem to agree on, is a process of capturing views across a broad base of the population. the thing is, the opposition team in this debate ignores that it is not just about that. It is about capturing views to generate good outcomes. The reason why we try and capture views is because, unlike tyrants, we don't know for sure what the outcomes are. But that does not mean that the outcomes do not matter at all, and that we should not assess outcomes based on whether they are good, based on our non-chimpanzee human moral understanding of outcomes. So, they've mistaken the end goal of democracy for its process. And note that people don't actually prefer the process over the end goal, because they vote with their feet. When people are disillusioned with the process of democracy, when they feel that their views are not being captured, or that it captures their views quite well, but it generates shitty outcomes, then they choose things like they vote for tyrants, who say, well, it doesn't matter if we don't capture these views, or we can decide for you what is better, we're more dynamic, or they do things like prefer political systems like that in China. That is the challenge in today's debate, to say that we don't have to think about democratic outcomes and we can just trust democracy to sort itself out is, I think, hopelessly naive. The first reason for that is, it is actually quite bad at capturing views, which is a big part of what we said, and we don't think we got a good response out of this. Because what we said was, the young are being excluded from politics because the outsized influence of the old, both in terms of lobbying and economic power that they've accrued over the years, as well as the fact that they are demographically more in number and are likely to increase in number relative to the young, mean that the young are politically apathetic. They said the solution is to resolve voter apathy. We agree, that's exactly what we're doing. And the way in which we do that is by firstly saying to the young very clearly, we now as a political system care more about your votes than the people of ages 50 and above. That is a strong signal to them that is likely to get them to respond. And secondly, that politicians are likely to respond to that signal in ways that are very direct and make the young more engaged in politics. So we did fix voter apathy, and therefore we did capture a greater segment of the population and their views. Okay, now on outcomes. Now their main response to our discussion about outcomes was not to dispute that the outcomes we got happened, but it was to say that we cannot be sure what outcomes are good. Firstly, they said, well, it is the same rhetoric as dictators use, therefore it is bad, but obviously, just because we use the same rhetoric as dictators does not automatically mean that if you use this rhetoric, you too are a dictator. Then they said, there is a slippery slope, because once you start to give more votes to one group of people, or overweight the votes of one group of people, then soon you will start to overweight the votes of like cis white men or other people we don't like as woke debaters or whatever it is. But obviously, slippery slope memes are not a thing. And we can see this in the real world because, as I pointed out, and as Sharique pointed out, we already overweight some votes in existing political systems, when the votes of people in constituencies with smaller populations are overweighted relative to the votes of citizens in urban centers. And we do so for good reason, because otherwise it would indeed be like these two wise Indians says, lions voting for what's for dinner with the sheep. We recognize that some parties are disadvantaged and we therefore overweight their votes. Doing the corollary is pretty much the same thing. What were the outcomes that we did get? That we can use some reasonable, though of course not super objective and definitely correct assessment. We said firstly that the old are less likely to be long-termist in their views because they have less of a skin in the game, they have less ahead of them. Obviously they still care, but they just care less. They're less likely to be flexible, more likely to be nostalgic. They try to spin this as a good thing, but I think the analysis that we gave about their views being locked in the past and being unable to keep up with things that are actually changing around them and paradigms changing means that they make worse decisions. We told them they're less exposed to policy, so less likely to care. Their response was to say, but then the old will be rotted over because we won't have enough pensions. But we told you that one, they were already in a position of strength. They were much richer. There are other political avenues of expression that young often advocate for them in the knowledge that they will one day become old. And just also crucially, forgetting the base rate, and in the vast majority of countries we're talking about here, the old are in no danger with regards to the pension schemes. Look, this was about getting good outcomes and capturing correct views.
Thank both teams for the proceed to the
It on.
Thank you.
Cheers, bro.
Thank you.